the heart of Mississippi in 1849, where cotton grew taller than free men's dreams and the Mississippi River carried more tears than water, there exists a story that official records never dared to document. The Riverside Mansion, with its white columns and perfumed gardens, was the stage for what newspapers of the time called an inexplicable family tragedy, a wedding banquet that transformed into a collective wake. In a single January night, 17 members of Warren County's most prominent families succumbed to a slow and agonizing death. Their faces contorted in expressions that doctors could never explain. What they didn't know was that the answer lay in the calloused hands of a woman who had lost everything, but found something much more powerful: the patience to serve justice on the finest plate that society had ever tasted. This is the story of Celia, a cook who transformed spices into revenge and recipes into death sentences. A woman who chose her own surname when she decided she would no longer be anyone's property. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and if this is your first time on our channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that official history preferred to forget. The Riverside Plantation stretched over more than 2,000 acres along the muddy banks of the Mississippi, its endless rows of cotton undulating like a white sea under the scorching summer sun of 1848. It was one of Warren County's most prosperous properties, known not only for the quality of its harvest, but for the opulence of its main house, and primarily for the excellence of its table. Colonel James Riverside had inherited the property from his father and expanded it with the same calculated brutality that characterized men of his position. Tall, thin as a whip, and with eyes the color of winter ice, he commanded his 340 slaves with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. He firmly believed that severe discipline, tempered with small concessions, maintained order better than pure violence. The jewel of his property wasn't the cotton, but rather the culinary reputation that attracted visitors from neighboring plantations, politicians from Jackson, merchants who navigated the Mississippi, and planters from nearby counties made sure to accept invitations to Riverside dinners. The secret of this fame resided in the hands of a woman whom few guests ever saw, but whose talent everyone savored. Celia had arrived at the plantation as a child in 1829, part of a lot of slaves purchased from a bankrupt property in South Carolina. She was then only 8 years old, with large, curious eyes and an extraordinary memory for flavors and aromas. The head cook of the time, an elderly woman named Mama Ruth, soon noticed the girl's natural gift and took her under her protection. For 16 years, Celia learned not only to cook, but to understand the secrets of spices, the science behind fermentation, the mysteries of herbs that grew wild in the nearby swamps. Mama Ruth, born in Africa and brought to America as a young woman, carried ancestral knowledge about medicinal plants and their properties. She taught Celia that every leaf, every root, every seed had a purpose, some to heal, others to cause sleep, and some had purposes that were better not mentioned aloud. Mama Ruth would say while they dried herbs under the moon, that their people had known the secrets of the earth since before the ships, since before the chains. This knowledge lived in the blood, passed from mother to daughter, like an inheritance that could never be stolen. Mama Ruth also taught Celia something equally valuable: how to read and write. During the long winter nights when kitchen work diminished, she showed the girl how to form letters in the sand, how to decipher words in the main house's recipe books, how to keep secret records of her discoveries about plants. The old healer always emphasized that knowledge was the only inheritance that no one could steal. If Celia knew how to read, she could learn anything. If she knew how to write, she could leave her mark on the world, even when others thought she was invisible. When Mama Ruth died of fever in 1845, Celia naturally assumed her place as head cook. She was then 24 years old, had married a blacksmith named Samuel, and given birth to 3 children: Thomas, born in 1841, Mary, born in 1842, and little David, born in 1844. The family lived in a cabin slightly larger than the others, a privilege granted due to Celia's importance to the house's reputation. Colonel Riverside rarely addressed Celia directly, communicating his demands through his wife, Rosalind, a pale and nervous woman who spent most of her time embroidering and taking laudanum for her nervous conditions. It was Rosalind who planned the menus for special occasions, always consulting a recipe book that had belonged to her mother-in-law. But it was Celia who transformed those instructions into edible works of art. The main house kitchen was Celia's kingdom, spacious with a large iron stove with multiple ovens, shelves filled with spices from distant places through river trade, and a pantry that rivaled those of urban hotels. She commanded a team of 6 assistants, all young women she had trained herself. Each had her specialty. Sarah handled breads and sweets. Hannah prepared meats. Lily was responsible for preserves and pickles, but Celia kept the most important secrets to herself. She was the one who prepared the special sauces that made guests sigh with pleasure. She who knew exactly how long to let the ham smoke to achieve perfect texture. She who knew the exact combination of herbs that transformed a simple chicken broth into something memorable. Celia's children lived in the slave quarters with the other children, but sometimes came to the kitchen when she needed to watch them while working. Thomas, at 7 years old in 1848, already showed interest in learning his father's trade at the forge and frequently accompanied him when her kitchen duties allowed. Mary, at 6 years old, had inherited her mother's curiosity about plants and sometimes accompanied her when Celia collected herbs near the slave quarters. David, still small at 4 years old, was content to play with corn dolls that Celia made for him in her rare free moments. Life on the plantation followed a predictable rhythm, and within the limits imposed by slavery, was relatively stable. Celia had found a way to protect her family through her indispensable usefulness. The colonel would never sell the cook, who guaranteed his social reputation, and by extension, would never separate her family. It was an illusion of security that she carefully cultivated without realizing that stability in a slave's life was always a mirage, always dependent on the whims and moods of those who held absolute power over their lives. Addison Riverside, the colonel's eldest son, had recently returned from his studies in Natchez. At 22 years old, he was a younger and cruel version of his father with the same cold gaze, but without the discipline that came with age and responsibility. He had developed during his college years a taste for diversions that involved exercising power over those who couldn't defend themselves. Celia had noticed how Addison looked at her younger assistants, how he found excuses to visit the kitchen when his father wasn't present. She had begun keeping the girls always busy when he appeared, always under her direct supervision. But she couldn't be everywhere at once, and Addison had all the time in the world. What Celia didn't know was that Addison had noticed her children during their brief visits to the kitchen, and that in his twisted mind, he was beginning to see in them an opportunity to amuse himself in a way he considered completely innocent. After all, they were just games, and slave children, well, they needed to learn early what their place in the world was. During the hot summer afternoons, when fieldwork slightly diminished, Addison often wandered the property, looking for ways to entertain himself. He had developed a particular interest in educating slave children about hierarchy and obedience, creating cruel games that he considered valuable lessons. Celia sensed the growing tension in the quarters when Addison appeared. Mothers pulled their children closer, men lowered their eyes and continued working with renewed intensity. But she couldn't imagine that her own children would soon become the focus of the young master's twisted attention. The Riverside plantation functioned like a small kingdom with its own unwritten rules and complex hierarchies. At the top was the colonel, followed by his family, then the white overseers, and finally the slaves in their own internal subdivisions. Celia had learned to navigate this system carefully, using her privileged position as cook to protect her family as much as possible. But protection, she was about to discover, was an illusion that could be shattered in a single moment of casual cruelty. The autumn of 1848 arrived in Mississippi with deceptive beauty, painting the oak leaves in golden tones and filling the air with the sweet aroma of sugarcane being harvested. It was the time of year that Celia most appreciated, when kitchen work intensified with the preparation of winter preserves and dinners became more elaborate, celebrating the season's abundance. That October morning, Celia woke before dawn, as she always did. The air was fresh, almost cold, and a thin mist covered the fields like a ghostly veil. She lit the fire in the kitchen and began preparing breakfast for the main house, her movements automatic after so many years of routine. Samuel had already left for the forge, and the children still slept deeply on their small straw mattresses in the quarters. The day promised to be special. The colonel had announced that he would receive a group of neighboring planters interested in discussing cultivation techniques and possible commercial partnerships. It was the type of occasion that demanded Celia's best, a lunch that would impress men accustomed to fine dining and convince them that Riverside was a prosperous and well-managed property. Celia had planned the menu meticulously. Turtle soup with cherry, roasted duck with wild berry sauce, ham glazed with honey and mustard, sides of caramelized sweet potato, and green beans with almonds. For dessert, her famous bourbon pudding with vanilla cream, a recipe she had perfected over the years, and that never failed to draw praise from guests. While supervising her assistant's work, Celia allowed herself a moment of silent pride. She had transformed the Riverside Plantation kitchen into something that rivaled the best establishments in Natchez or Vicksburg. Her work not only sustained the colonel's social reputation, but also provided relative protection for her family. It was a delicate balance, but one she had learned to maintain with mastery. Around 10:00 the morning, Thomas, Mary, and David appeared in the kitchen, as they did when Celia needed to watch them during work. Thomas had fed the chickens in the quarters. Mary had helped the older women collect eggs, and David, still too small for serious work, had simply tried to help his older siblings. Celia gave them pieces of sweet bread left over from the main house's breakfast and instructed them to stay near the kitchen where she could supervise them. Celia established the rules as she always did. The children should remain visible. Thomas should take care of his younger siblings, and David shouldn't wander off. Thomas, serious like a miniature adult, nodded with understanding and assumed responsibility for his siblings. Celia watched them play in the small courtyard behind the kitchen, their laughter echoing in the morning air. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a different future for them. Perhaps Thomas could learn to read and write as she had learned. Perhaps Mary could use her knowledge of plants for something beyond survival. Perhaps David could grow up in a world where being black didn't automatically mean being someone's property. They were dangerous dreams, she knew. Dreams that could break a mother's heart, but they were all she had to offer her children besides love and protection. The morning passed quickly in lunch preparation. The guests arrived at noon. Well-dressed men arriving on horseback and in simple wagons, speaking in loud voices about cotton prices and cultivation techniques. Celia could hear them from the other side of the dining room door while serving the dishes, their voices confident and satisfied. The lunch was an absolute success. She could tell by the way the guests savored each dish, by the praise that reached the kitchen through the servants who served at the table. The colonel was clearly satisfied, and Rosalind even sent a congratulatory message through Sarah. It was almost 3:00 the afternoon when Celia realized she hadn't seen the children for some time. Normally, they appeared in the kitchen around noon, asking for something to eat or simply to be near their mother. Their absence left her slightly uneasy, but she consoled herself, thinking they were probably playing in the quarters and had lost track of time. It was Hannah who brought the first alarming news. She had gone to get firewood from the depot near the quarters and seen smoke coming from the old barn, the one that was no longer used to store hay, and stood at the boundary between the cotton fields and the slave area. Hannah arrived, running to the kitchen, breathless, reporting the presence of heavy smoke coming from the old barn. Celia's heart stopped for a moment. The old barn was near the quarters where the children sometimes played when they weren't under her direct supervision. Without thinking twice, she dropped the spoon she was using to stir the sauce and ran toward the door. She shouted over her shoulder for Sarah to take care of the kitchen, already running through the fields. The smoke was visible in the distance, a thick black column rising against the blue afternoon sky. Celia ran like she had never run in her life, her heart beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. Other slaves had noticed the smoke and were running in the same direction, carrying water buckets from nearby wells. When she reached the barn, the structure was already completely engulfed in flames. The heat was intense, almost unbearable, and the black smoke made it difficult to breathe. But it was the sound that terrified her. Muffled screams coming from inside the burning structure, voices she immediately recognized. Celia screamed about her children being inside, trying to approach the entrance. Strong hands held her, preventing her from running into the inferno. It was Samuel who had come running from the forge upon seeing the smoke. Samuel shouted that she would die, struggling to hold her while she fought desperately. Other men tried to approach the entrance, but the flames were too intense. The old, dry wooden structure burned like paper, and the roof was already beginning to collapse. The screams from inside grew weaker, then ceased completely. Celia stopped fighting and fell to her knees in the dirt. A sound coming from her throat that was neither quite a scream nor quite a moan, but something more primitive, deeper. It was the sound of a soul breaking in half. It took almost 2 hours for the fire to be completely extinguished. When they could finally enter the smoking ruins, they found the 3 small bodies embraced in a corner where they had tried to hide from the flames. Thomas had tried to protect his younger siblings with his own body, but it hadn't been enough. What was later discovered was that the barn door had been locked from the outside. Someone had deliberately trapped the children inside before setting fire to the structure. But who and why? Addison Riverside appeared at the fire scene about an hour later, claiming to have been riding in the distant fields and only seeing the smoke when returning to the house. He expressed his condolences to the colonel for the loss of valuable property and suggested it had probably been an accident. Children playing with matches perhaps, but Lily, one of the younger kitchen assistants, had seen Addison near the barn that morning. She had gone to collect wild herbs near the quarters and seen him talking with the children, laughing at something Thomas had said. When she told this to Celia 3 days after the funeral, her words were like a second death. Lily revealed that Addison had been playing with the children, mentioning knowing a new game they would like. He had instructed the children to enter the barn, promising to fetch a surprise for them. Celia said nothing. She just nodded and continued peeling potatoes for dinner. But something inside her had changed at that moment. Something had died along with her children, and something new had been born in its place. That night, alone in her empty cabin, Celia made a decision. She would no longer be just Celia, the Riverside plantation cook. From that moment on, she would be Celia Washington. She had chosen the surname of the first president, the man who had fought for his nation's freedom, and she too would fight for her own freedom. Not the freedom to flee. That would be too easy, too quick. She wanted the freedom that came with justice, the freedom that would only come when those who had taken everything from her paid the full price. Celia Washington began to plan. During the days that followed the funeral, she maintained her normal routine in the kitchen. But at night, when everyone slept, she silently left her cabin and walked to the place where her children had died. There, kneeling among the still smoking ruins, she made promises that no human ear heard. She whispered to the blackened earth about Thomas, Mary, and David, promising she wouldn't forget and would make them all pay. And on moonless nights when the darkness was deepest, she began collecting the plants that Mama Ruth had taught her to recognize. Plants that grew only in places where death had touched the earth. Plants that carried in their roots and leaves the darkest secrets of nature. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow the unfolding of this story that forever changed a plantation in Mississippi. The months that followed the children's death transformed Celia in ways that no one at the Riverside plantation could completely understand. Externally, she continued being the same efficient cook as always, perhaps even more meticulous, more dedicated to details, but those who knew her well noticed subtle changes that left them uneasy. Samuel was the first to notice. His wife had become silent in a different way. It wasn't just grief. It was something deeper, more calculated. She spent hours awake during the night, sitting by the window of her cabin, looking toward the main house with an expression he couldn't decipher. When he tried to talk about the future, about perhaps trying to have other children, she responded as if he were speaking a foreign language. Celia had made it clear that there was no future in her mind, only the present, and the present was all that mattered. In the kitchen, Celia had begun making subtle changes. She insisted on personally preparing all dishes that went to the Riverside family table, not allowing any of her assistants to touch the food after she finished the final seasonings. She said it was to maintain quality, but Hannah noticed that she had begun storing certain herbs and spices in a locked cabinet, to which only she had the key. When questioned about these unknown herbs, Celia simply explained they were special ingredients reserved for special occasions. What Hannah didn't know was that Celia had begun making nocturnal expeditions to the swamps surrounding the plantation. Using the knowledge that Mama Ruth had transmitted to her, she collected plants that grew only in specific soils, under specific conditions. Mushrooms that sprouted on rotting logs, vines that wrapped around dead trees, roots that could only be harvested during autumn and early winter. Mama Ruth had taught her about these plants when she was young, but always with severe warnings. She had said some were for healing pains that white doctors didn't know how to cure, showing some dried leaves, and others were for when healing was no longer possible, when only justice remained. Celia now perfectly understood what the old healer had meant. During the winter of 1848, she experimented. Small doses, almost imperceptible, added to Addison Riverside's food. Nothing that could kill him, not yet. Just enough to cause discomfort, to make him question his own health. Inexplicable stomach pains, nausea that came and went without apparent reason, nights of insomnia followed by days of extreme fatigue. Addison began complaining about his health with increasing frequency. He consulted doctors in Vicksburg and even in Natchez, but none could find a cause for his symptoms. Some suggested it could be stress. Others recommended dietary changes. One particularly perceptive doctor suggested that perhaps he should avoid heavily spiced foods for a while. Celia almost smiled when she heard this recommendation being discussed in the dining room. If only they knew that the problem wasn't the spices she used, but rather the special ingredients she had begun adding. Meanwhile, she observed, she studied the house patterns, meal schedules, each family member's food preferences. She discovered that the Colonel had a predilection for rich, dark sauces, that Rosalind preferred delicate and lightly sweet dishes, that Addison liked rare meats and strong seasonings. More importantly, she discovered that the Riverside family was planning something big for early 1849. Pearl, the Colonel's youngest daughter, had become engaged to Sylvester Thompson, son of a prominent cotton planter family from the neighboring county. The wedding was scheduled for late January and would be the region's most important social occasion in months. Rosalind had begun preparations months in advance, consulting Celia almost daily about the menu for the wedding banquet. It would be an intimate event just for close families and some dear relatives. Riverside's culinary reputation would be put to the test before people who really mattered to the family. During one of these consultations, Rosalind emphasized that the wedding needed to be absolutely perfect, a very special family event where everyone would remember the Riverside's hospitality. Celia assured it would be perfect, a promise she truly intended to keep, and she really promised it would be perfect, perfectly planned, perfectly executed, perfectly final. During the long winter nights, Celia began elaborating her plan. It wouldn't just be a matter of poisoning the food. That would be too simple, too obvious. She wanted something more subtle, more artistic. She wanted each person present at the banquet to receive exactly what they deserved in the exact measure of their sins. She began researching who would be present at the wedding. Through conversations she heard in the main house, letters she saw being written, preparations she observed, she built a mental map of who would be present that night. The complete Riverside family, the Colonel, Rosalind, Addison, Pearl, and her younger brother Charles. The Thompson family, Sylvester's parents, his 2 brothers and 1 sister. Some close uncles and cousins from both families. 17 people in total. 17 lives that had benefited directly or indirectly from the system that had killed her children. 17 people who had never questioned the right to own other human beings, to separate families, to treat children as property. Each name she discovered was added to her mental list. And for each name, she began planning a specific destiny. Colonel Riverside, who had allowed his son to kill 3 innocent children and then covered up the crime, would receive the main course literally and figuratively. Addison, the direct murderer, would have a slower, more painful death. Rosalind, who had lived her entire life benefiting from others' suffering without ever questioning, would die confused and frightened without understanding what was happening. And the others, would receive a lesson about the true costs of their prosperity. Celia spent the rest of winter perfecting her recipes, not just the culinary ones, but the others, those that Mama Ruth had taught her in secret, those she had learned alone through careful experimentation and trial and error. She tested dosages, studied effects, calculated action times. A particularly important discovery was that she could prepare special dishes for the few children who would be present, the Thompsons' young children. They would receive completely different food, sweet porridges, and warm milk that would make them sleep deeply during the banquet. Celia had no interest in hurting innocents. Her justice was precise, directed only at those who carried guilt. During her nocturnal expeditions to the swamps, she also collected plants with mild sedative properties. The children would sleep peacefully while the adults paid for their families' sins. When spring arrived in Mississippi in 1849, Celia Washington was ready. She had transformed from a grieving cook into something much more dangerous. A woman with a plan, knowledge, and most importantly, nothing left to lose. Pearl Riverside's wedding would be remembered for generations, but not for the reasons the family expected. In her final weeks of preparation, Celia began leaving small signs of her transformation. She wrote in her secret notebook, the same one where Mama Ruth had taught her the first letters, not just recipes, but reflections on justice, on the price of silence, what happens when patience finally runs out. She wrote one night by candlelight that they thought they were invisible, that they didn't see, didn't remember, didn't feel, but they were the living memory of all their sins. And memory, when it finally speaks, has a voice that echoes through the centuries. Samuel noticed that she had begun using the surname Washington when signing her notes. When he asked about this, she explained having chosen her own name, declaring she was now free to choose her own destiny as well. He didn't completely understand what she meant, but something in her tone made him decide not to ask more. The morning of the 27th of January, 1849 dawned clear and cold in Mississippi, with a thin layer of frost covering the cotton fields like powdered sugar on a cake. It was Pearl Riverside's wedding day, and the plantation had been bustling with activity since before sunrise. Celia had awakened at 3:00 the morning, as she had planned for months, not from nervousness or anxiety, but because she had much work ahead, the kind of work that required absolute precision, perfect timing, and above all, a calm that she had cultivated during the long months of preparation. The main house kitchen had been transformed into a military operations center. 3 ovens functioned simultaneously. Enormous pots bubbled over the fire, and her 5 assistants moved in a rehearsed choreography, each responsible for specific aspects of the banquet. But Celia maintained absolute control over the most important elements, the seasonings, the sauces, and especially the final touches of each dish. The menu had been planned with the meticulousness of a general preparing for battle. Fresh oyster appetizers from New Orleans through river trade, served with mignonette sauce she had prepared herself, turtle soup with cherry, a specialty she had perfected over the years. The main course would be a whole roasted pork, glazed with honey and mustard, accompanied by smoked ham, roasted duck with cherry sauce, and a variety of sides that would make guests remember this banquet for the rest of their lives, which, as Celia knew, wouldn't be very long. The guests began arriving around noon. Wagons and horses climbed the circular road leading to the main house, bringing the Riverside's closest families. Celia observed them discreetly through the kitchen window, identifying faces she had studied for months through descriptions and overheard conversations. There was the Thompson family patriarch, Colonel Wilfred Thompson, known for his brutal disciplinary practices on his own plantations. Beside him, his wife Matilda, who was famous for separating slave families as a strategy to prevent excessive bonds. The 2 eldest Thompson sons, Seth and Randolph, both following their father's cruel footsteps. The youngest daughter, Jeanette, who despite her youth, already demonstrated the same contempt for slaves that characterized her family. 17 guests in total, each carrying their own guilt, their own sins against humanity, and Celia had prepared something special for each of them. The wedding ceremony was held in the main house garden, under a pavilion decorated with white flowers and silk ribbons. Pearl was radiant in her lace dress imported from Charleston, and Sylvester Thompson looked appropriately nervous beside the improvised altar. Reverend Matthews, a corpulent man who served several plantations in the region, conducted the ceremony with his usual sonorous voice. Celia observed everything from the kitchen window while supervising the final preparations. There was something almost surreal about seeing all that celebration of happiness and love, knowing what was to come, but she felt no remorse, only a cold and calculated satisfaction. When the ceremony ended and the guests headed to the dining room, Celia made an almost imperceptible signal to her assistants. It was time to serve. The hall had been decorated with the best the Riverside house had to offer. Crystals reflected the light of dozens of candles, The family silver gleamed on the white linen tablecloth, and elaborate floral arrangements perfumed the air. The guests took their places at an oval-shaped table that dominated the environment, with the newlyweds at the center and the most important families in positions of honor. Before the main banquet, Celia had prepared something special for the 3 children present: 2 young Thompson children and a Riverside niece. She personally served sweet porridge, seasoned with honey and mild spices, plus warm milk with vanilla. The children savored the delicacies and within minutes began yawning. Their mothers, thinking it was just natural fatigue from the day's excitement, took them to rest in one of the upper rooms. Celia had calculated perfectly. The children would sleep deeply for hours, protected from what was to come. The first course was served without incident. The oysters were received with general approval, and Celia noted with satisfaction that even the most demanding guests seemed impressed. She had used only a very light touch of her special ingredients in this dish, just enough to begin the process, to prepare the guests' digestive systems for what was to come. The turtle soup was an even greater success. Colonel Riverside stood to make a toast, publicly praising his cook's skill and provoking a round of applause from the guests. Celia, observing discreetly through the kitchen's half-open door, allowed herself a small, cold smile. It was during the main course that things began to get interesting. Celia had spent weeks calculating dosages through trial and error for each person. Colonel Wilfred Thompson, for example, received a generous portion of the roasted pork, seasoned with a special combination of herbs she had collected during autumn and early winter. The effect would be gradual, but inexorable. First, a sensation of heat, then growing nausea, followed by convulsions, and finally, respiratory paralysis. For Matilda Thompson, who had the habit of separating slave families, Celia had prepared something more poetic. Her dish contained a carefully calculated dose of a toxin that would cause terrible hallucinations before death. She would see her own victims returning to haunt her, feel the despair of the families she had separated. The Thompson sons received dishes containing substances that would attack their nervous systems, causing gradual loss of motor coordination, followed by paralysis. They would feel their bodies slowly failing just as they had failed to protect those under their power. And Addison received special treatment. Celia had saved for him a combination of 3 different toxins, each activating at different moments. First would come intense abdominal pain, then loss of motor coordination, and finally a paralysis that would leave him conscious but unable to move while his body slowly stopped functioning. The banquet proceeded for almost 2 hours, with guests savoring each dish and effusively praising the food's quality. There were toasts to the newlyweds, speeches about family prosperity, animated conversations about politics and business. The atmosphere was one of genuine celebration and contentment. It was around 9 at night that the first symptoms began to appear. Colonel Thompson was the first to complain of sudden malaise. He had just finished a speech about the importance of maintaining discipline on plantations when he suddenly paled and put his hand to his stomach. His wife, sitting beside him, asked if he was well, but before he could answer, she herself began feeling a burning sensation in her throat. Within minutes, the elegant hall transformed into a scene of chaos. Guests began rising abruptly from their chairs, some running outside seeking fresh air, others doubling over in pain on the table. The sound of animated conversations was replaced by moans of agony and screams of panic. Addison Riverside tried to stand to help the guests, but his legs didn't obey. He looked down, confused, trying to understand why his body wasn't responding to his commands. It was then that his eyes met Celis's, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway to observe the results of her work. For a moment they looked at each other across the chaotic hall, and in that moment Addison understood. His eyes widened with terror when comprehension arrived, but it was already too late. His mouth opened as if to scream, but no sound came out. Celia observed him for a few more seconds, then calmly turned and returned to the kitchen. She had work to do. Dishes to wash, evidence to destroy, an escape to execute. But first, she had one last task. From her apron pocket, she took out a small piece of paper where she had written a message in her best handwriting. She placed the paper on the kitchen table, clearly visible, and left through the back door. The message simply said, "For Thomas, Mary, and David, justice has been served. Celia Washington." When the first neighbors and the local doctor arrived at the Riverside plantation the next morning, they found 17 bodies scattered throughout the dining hall, some still sitting in their chairs, others fallen on the floor in grotesque positions. There were no adult survivors. The 3 children were found sleeping deeply in the upper room, completely unharmed and with no memory of what had happened during the night. And Celia Washington had disappeared into the darkness, taking with her only the clothes on her body and the satisfaction of justice finally served. The discovery of the carnage at the Riverside plantation sent shockwaves throughout the entire South. 17 of Mississippi's most prominent citizens dead in a single night, during what should have been a celebration of union and prosperity. Newspapers in Jackson, Natchez, and even distant cities like Charleston and Richmond dedicated entire pages to what quickly became known as the Riverside Wedding Massacre. Authorities arrived at the plantation on the morning of the 28th of January, alerted by Samuel, who had found the main house door open and an unnatural silence coming from inside. The Warren County Sheriff, a man named Patrick Lambert, would later describe the scene as something from Dante's worst nightmares. The bodies were scattered throughout the elegant dining hall in positions suggesting extreme agony. Some had tried to flee, being found near doors and windows. Others had fallen on the table, their faces contorted in expressions of unbearable pain. Most disturbing was that many still had their eyes open, as if they had remained conscious until the end. Addison Riverside was found in his chair, body rigid, but eyes still gleaming with terror. The doctor who examined the bodies later commented that he had never seen such an intense expression of fear preserved in death. It was as if Addison had understood exactly what was happening and why, but was unable to do anything to stop it. The initial investigation focused on the possibility of mass poisoning, an obvious conclusion given the context, but determining the specific agent proved more challenging. Doctors found varied symptoms they had never seen before, each victim presenting different signs of suffering. It was as if each person had been poisoned individually, with substances chosen specifically for them. It was when they found the message in the kitchen that the true nature of the crime began to reveal itself for Thomas, Mary, and David. Justice has been served. Celia Washington was written in careful handwriting, the words burning in the minds of all who read them like a confession and a declaration of war simultaneously. Colonel Riverside, who had been traveling on business in Natchez during the wedding and thus escaped the tragedy, returned immediately upon receiving the news. When shown the message, his face visibly palled. He knew exactly who Thomas, Mary, and David were, and began to understand the magnitude of what had happened. The colonel murmured to himself, questioning how a simple cook could have executed such a plan. But Celia had not been a simple cook for a long time. She had transformed into something much more dangerous, a woman with knowledge, determination, and a thirst for justice that had consumed everything else in her life. The search for Celia Washington began immediately. Posters with her description were spread throughout Mississippi and neighboring states. A reward of $500 was offered for her capture, dead or alive, a considerable sum for the time, reflecting both the fear and anger her act had provoked. But Celia had disappeared like smoke. Some reported seeing her walking rural roads heading north. Others swore she had been seen boarding a steamboat on the Mississippi River. There were even rumors that she had been helped by a network of abolitionists, though no concrete evidence was ever found. The truth was simpler and more complex. At the same time, Celia had planned her escape with the same meticulousness she had applied to the poisoning. For months, she had hidden small quantities of food and supplies in strategic locations along a route she had memorized through the swamps and forests of Mississippi. She knew she couldn't use the main roads or navigable rivers. Those would be the first places they would look for her. Instead, she followed old hunting trails and paths known only to fugitive slaves, moving mainly at night and resting during the day in hideouts she had prepared in advance. Samuel was extensively interrogated by authorities, but genuinely didn't know where his wife had gone. He had noticed the changes in her after the children's death, but never imagined she was capable of something so elaborate and devastating. When shown the message she had left, he cried, not from sadness, but from a complex mixture of pride, terror, and loss. Samuel admitted to Sheriff Lambert that Celia had always been stronger than anyone imagined, but confessed he had never thought she was capable of such an act. The consequences of the massacre spread far beyond the Riverside plantation. Planters throughout the South began looking at their own domestic slaves with renewed suspicion. Cooks, in particular, were subjected to increased surveillance. Many prominent families dismissed their slave cooks and hired free whites, paying high salaries for a sense of security that may have been illusory. Paranoia spread like a disease. Elaborate dinners, which had once been symbols of Southern status and hospitality, became tense events where hosts tasted each dish before serving guests. Some planters went to the extreme of hiring professional tasters like ancient kings, but perhaps the most significant impact was psychological. For the first time, the Southern elite was forced to confront the reality that their slaves were not passive property, but human beings with memories, emotions, and most frighteningly, the capacity to plan and execute revenge. Celia Washington had broken a fundamental illusion upon which the entire slave society was based. The illusion that submission was natural, that oppression could continue indefinitely without consequences. 3 months after the massacre, a merchant reported seeing a black woman working on a small farm in Tennessee, a state where fugitive slave laws were less rigorously enforced. The description vaguely matched Celia's, but when authorities investigated, they found no trace of her. There were other sightings over the years in Kentucky, Ohio, even Canada, but none were confirmed. The truth about Celia Washington's final fate remained a mystery. Some believe she had died in the swamps during her escape. Others insisted she had managed to reach freedom in the North or Canada. There were even those who whispered that she was still alive somewhere, living under a false name, perhaps even helping other slaves escape. What wasn't a mystery was the legacy she had left. In slave quarters throughout the South, her name was whispered with a mixture of admiration and terror. She had proven that even the most oppressed could find ways to resist, to fight back, to demand justice. For slave owners, Celia Washington became a recurring nightmare, a constant reminder that their prosperity was built on foundations much more fragile than they had imagined. Every meal became a matter of trust, every cook a potential source of danger, and somewhere, perhaps on a small farm in Ohio, or in a modest house in Detroit, or walking the free streets of Boston, a woman who had chosen her own surname continued living, no longer as someone's property, no longer as a victim, but as Celia Washington, a woman who had proven that justice, even when delayed, eventually finds its way. The Riverside plantation never fully recovered from the massacre. The colonel tried to rebuild, but the property was cursed in everyone's mind. Free workers refused to accept employment there, and even slaves from other plantations whispered stories about ghosts that haunted the cotton fields. Eventually, the property was sold for a fraction of its previous value. The main house was demolished, and the fields were converted to other uses, but the memory remained, passed from generation to generation as a reminder that even in the most oppressive system, resistance finds a way. The 3 children who survived that night, the 2 Thompson children and the Riverside niece, grew up without any clear memory of what had happened. Their adoptive families never told them the complete truth, only that their parents had died in an inexplicable tragedy, but sometimes in their dreams they could still hear the echo of a gentle voice humming lullabies, and they would wake with tears in their eyes without knowing why. Samuel remained in the region for a few more years, working as a free blacksmith after the plantation's dissolution. He never remarried, but was frequently seen visiting the small cemetery where Thomas, Mary, and David were buried. When he died in 1867, witnesses reported that his last words were a message for Celia, expressing understanding and forgiveness. Reverend Matthews, who had officiated the fatal wedding, never again managed to perform a ceremony without trembling. He developed the habit of fasting for 3 days before any religious event. Convinced that God was testing his faith through fear, he died 2 years later. Some say from pure terror, others from a guilty conscience that finally consumed him. And sometimes on cold winter nights in Mississippi, when the wind blows through the fields where cotton once grew, local residents swear they can still hear the echo of a voice whispering through the darkness. For Thomas, Mary, and David, but there are also those who say they hear something more. The sound of firm footsteps walking down the dusty road, the noise of a woman who chose her own destiny and never looked back. Because Celia Washington wasn't just a story of revenge. She was a story of transformation, of a woman who refused to accept that her pain was insignificant, that her justice was impossible. She proved that even in the darkest moments of American history, there were always those who rose against injustice, who paid the price of resistance, who chose freedom, even when it cost everything. The story of Celia Washington remains as one of the most disturbing and complex episodes in 19th century American history. In a single night, she transformed a wedding banquet into a court of justice where 17 people paid with their lives for the sins of an entire society. Her act wasn't just personal revenge, it was a declaration that even those considered property possessed agency, memory, and the capacity to demand accountability. She proved that knowledge, when combined with determination and opportunity, could be more powerful than any chain or whip. What makes Celia's story even more impactful is her surgical precision. She didn't kill indiscriminately, but chose each victim based on their specific crimes against humanity. Each death was personalized, each suffering calculated to reflect the suffering these people had caused others. And in her final compassion, she protected innocent children, proving that her justice was guided by principles, not bloodlust. Today, more than 170 years later, Celia Washington's story continues to echo through time as a somber reminder that injustice, when ignored for too long, eventually finds its own form of correction. She wasn't just a woman who lost her children. She became the embodiment of the collective memory of all those who suffered in silence. What's most impressive about her story isn't just the magnitude of her revenge, but the patience with which she executed it. For months, she transformed her pain into knowledge, her anger into strategy, her grief into determination. Each spice she added to the dishes that fatal night carried the weight of generations of unacknowledged suffering. Celia Washington forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, revenge, and the price of systematic oppression. She reminds us that behind every system of domination exist real human beings with hearts that can be broken and minds that can plan retribution. Her choice to adopt the surname Washington wasn't accidental. It was a declaration of personal independence, a claim to her own identity in a world that saw her only as property. In that simple act of renaming herself, she transformed from victim to agent of her own history. Celia's final fate remains a mystery, and perhaps that's better. Her true victory wasn't escaping man's justice, but proving that justice has many faces, and sometimes it comes served on a fine porcelain plate, seasoned with herbs that grow in the dark swamps of Mississippi. The riverside plantation may have been destroyed, the bodies may have been buried, but Celia Washington's memory lives on. She became more than a person. She became a symbol, a warning, a promise that even in the cruelest systems, resistance finds a way. And perhaps somewhere on a cold night, when the wind blows through the empty fields where cotton once grew, you can still hear the echo of her voice whispering through the darkness. Justice may be served cold, but it is always served. If this story touched something inside you, it's because Celia Washington's memory still walks among us, reminding us that true freedom sometimes requires a price that few are willing to pay. Share this story with someone who needs to know that even in history's darkest moments, there were always those who refused to accept injustice in silence. If you want more stories like this, revealing forgotten chapters of American history, subscribe to the channel now. Leave a like to support this work and tell us in the comments. Do you believe Celia Washington found true freedom in the end? Was her justice legitimate, or was it just revenge? History doesn't give us easy answers, but it gives us Celia Washington, a woman who decided that some injustices are too great to be forgiven and that some memories are too powerful to be forgotten.